That afternoon, the atmosphere in the HYBE recording studio in Seoul felt more relaxed than usual as most of the staff and crew were waiting for their turn in the monthly evaluation session, which had been delayed slightly from the original schedule. And in the midst of this laid-back setting, Suga, dressed in a gray hoodie and a black knit cap, sat leaning back on the corner sofa while scrolling through his phone, occasionally letting out a quiet chuckle as he looked at the screen and glanced toward the internal camera that was routinely kept on for internal documentation of artist activities, with no tight schedule pressing that day. He appeared lighter in mood and even joined in the casual chatter with two managers and an audio editor who were adjusting the monitor settings at the main desk. And in an unplanned moment, when one of the crew mentioned that this weekend there would be a rescreening of the BTS concert documentary at a local theater, and that some fans were planning to attend together, Suga casually responded with a comment that quietly drew attention as he said, "Looks like AA will be watching that too," prompting a few people to glance over with curious expressions as if recognizing the initials as something previously mentioned in past internal conversations. Yet no one dug further since the moment wasn't focused on personal topics, and without any noticeable expression, Suga continued his activity as usual while sipping on an iced coffee just delivered by an assistant. The atmosphere remained normal, but some staff began quietly speculating who AA might be, not just because it sounded like any ordinary initial, but because it was mentioned in such a naturally familiar tone, and although no one confirmed or responded explicitly, the moment became a small spark that added a bit of color to the otherwise routine afternoon, especially considering that Suga isn't the type to openly discuss his personal life during casual workroom conversations, particularly when it comes to relationships that have never been publicly introduced. Yet his calm tone and relaxed demeanor kept everyone acting as usual. No one prompted additional comments or tried to steer the conversation toward private matters. The environment remained professional and composed as always, but one thing couldn't be denied. Since the moment he mentioned those initials, a few staff members started to notice that Suga had recently been smiling more often when using his phone, sometimes replying to messages while chuckling softly or showing a focused expression when listening to a voice note with one earbud in. And although all that could very well be part of regular communication at work, it was hard to ignore that such subtle shifts in behavior tend to draw attention when they come from someone as high profile as him, especially since his private life has always been closely guarded and rarely exposed to the public. So when he casually dropped someone's initials in such a familiar context, it was only natural for a few to begin forming quiet assumptions while still respecting his privacy. And the day concluded without any major surprises or follow-up statements, just a normal stream of daily activities, but with one small detail that could easily evolve into a buzz among those in the entertainment industry's inner circles. The following morning, the editing team that handled BTS's internal studio footage began reviewing clips from the previous day as part of their routine documentation archiving, and while sorting through timestamps and labeling sections that might be relevant for internal use or future promotional content, one of the junior staff members paused at the part where Suga had casually mentioned the initials AA, and although it was a brief and relaxed moment with no unusual expressions or behavior that would normally qualify it as a highlight, it was flagged simply for review due to the subtle curiosity it sparked among some team members. And even though the clip was not marked for public release or sharing, the internal tagging sparked a low-key discussion among a few personnel who had access to the material, not in a gossipy or invasive tone, but in a quiet, observational way that often happens when something slightly personal slips through the usual rhythm of professional routines. And later in the day, when Suga returned to the studio to review some pre-mixed tracks from a side project he'd been casually working on, he greeted the staff as usual, spending a few minutes checking the audio interface with the engineer before settling back on the same sofa near the window, and with minimal conversation taking place around him, he resumed scrolling on his phone in a quiet, focused way that had become a familiar sight in recent weeks. And during a short break, one of the tech team members handed him a set of updated headphone models to test, which led to a brief moment of silence followed by Suga casually asking if they could be sent to her for feedback too, using a tone that didn't name anyone specifically but left the impression of familiarity that didn't go unnoticed by the two staff members in the room. Yet as always, no one pressed further as professionalism and discretion were part of the culture inside the workspace, and instead, attention shifted back to the task at hand as Suga tested the new equipment and gave brief feedback on the tonal quality, taking a few notes on his phone between sessions. While outside the recording booth, another staff member briefly noted the use of the word her, and wondered if it connected to the AA initials mentioned earlier. Though again, no one voiced anything aloud, and in that subtle way, a picture began to form, not through dramatic revelations or exaggerated gestures, but through a string of consistent, quiet references that felt more personal than performative. And as the workday progressed with routine mixing and occasional coffee runs, Suga maintained his usual rhythm, occasionally stepping out for a short walk along the hallway or sipping from his tumbler while listening to demo tracks. And while nothing overtly different could be identified in his behavior, the recurring presence of quiet gestures, small smiles during message checks, the use of first-person singular when referring to non-work-related plans, and a slightly warmer tone when speaking about certain offhand details, created an impression that he was in a phase of contentment grounded in personal connection, something gentle and unspoken, yet quietly visible to those who worked closely with him every day. And although such patterns didn't necessarily translate to any formal declaration or public acknowledgement, within the everyday rhythm of studio life, those nuances often said more than any formal statement ever could. And that afternoon ended like many others, with lights dimming as the session wrapped, laptops closing, and staff exchanging short goodbyes, while Suga lingered a few minutes longer in the hallway before putting on his mask and slipping out through the side door, his phone once again in hand, with that same faint smile that had started to feel familiar to those who had grown used to seeing it recently. The following hour, after leaving the studio, Suga was scheduled to meet a longtime collaborator at a small cafe near Hanam where HYB occasionally held informal meetings, and upon arriving, he chose to sit at one of the outdoor tables partly shaded by plants, creating a quiet and comfortable atmosphere that suited his low-key presence. And while he waited, he remained on his phone, sometimes responding to messages, sometimes just scrolling, with the same relaxed demeanor he had shown in the studio earlier that day. And during this brief window of personal time, a barista who had seen him several times before walked by to serve his usual drink without needing to confirm the order, suggesting a regularity in his visits that may have gone unnoticed publicly. And not long after, the collaborator arrived and they began discussing a potential short-form documentary piece centered on the quiet routines of working musicians in urban life, a theme that Suga had expressed interest in, exploring not from a promotional angle but as a reflection of the small, unnoticed parts of a musician's life. And as they shared ideas and examples, the topic shifted briefly to audience connection and how sometimes certain fans grow to become more than just followers, especially when mutual respect and understanding are present beyond the public gaze, to which Suga responded with a contemplative nod, adding only that the best listeners are often the ones who never ask for anything. Statement that didn't draw further elaboration but carried a weight that matched the theme of their conversation. And although nothing was spoken directly about relationships, the collaborator noted the subtle warmth in Suga's tone, and how it seemed to reflect a sense of grounded peace, something not always easily visible in public-facing artists. And once the meeting wrapped, Suga took a quiet stroll down the nearby path along the edge of the neighborhood, occasionally pausing to take a photo or glance around, unbothered by fans or cameras, largely due to his understated appearance and the discreet nature of his usual routines. And after a short walk, he entered a nearby bookstore known for its collection of art and design books, spending time in the corner aisle where photography monographs were displayed. And while he didn't purchase anything that day, he stood reading the sleeve of one book for several minutes, as if immersed in a quiet thought before eventually putting it back in place and making his way to the exit. And as he left, the staff greeted him with a small nod, recognizing him not as a celebrity but as a familiar visitor, which further highlighted how seamlessly Suga blended into his surroundings when away from official duties. And just before he returned home, he made one more stop, a small flower shop 2 blocks down the road where he occasionally picked up minimalist arrangements, and without asking, the florist handed him a modest bouquet wrapped in brown paper as if it had been prearranged. And although no card was attached, Suga smiled lightly, took it with a quiet thank you, and exited the store, disappearing into the late afternoon light without drawing attention. And within these simple movements, the coffee, the conversation, the bookshop, and the bouquet, lay the outline of someone whose life, though often examined under a spotlight, remained built on everyday rhythms and subtle gestures. And while the public would continue to speculate about initials and references, those closest to the reality would understand that Suga's world was composed not of headlines or statements, but of moments like these that quietly built connection, meaning, and comfort away from the noise of expectation. that same evening, just as dusk settled across the city and the streets began to quiet down. Suga returned to his apartment carrying the bouquet from the flower shop, a small paper bag containing the remains of his cafe order, and the same calm expression he had worn throughout the day, and upon entering his home, he placed the flowers in a slim white ceramic vase near the window where the last traces of natural light still spilled in, and for a few minutes he stood there quietly, observing the arrangement as if adjusting the balance of its presence in the room, then moved on to his desk where his laptop and small recording interface remained open from a previous session, and with a practiced motion he slipped on his headphones and resumed editing a short instrumental piece he had been revisiting over the past week. And although it was a personal project with no specific release date, he treated the process with the same quiet focus that defined most of his creative output, refining layers and adjusting volume levels in a way that suggested both habit and affection for the craft itself. And as the music looped in his ears, he occasionally glanced at his phone, responding to one or two messages with brief taps and then placed the device face down again, suggesting a degree of discipline in separating focus from distraction. And when the track reached a point that satisfied him, he leaned back slightly and took a few deep breaths, sipping from a glass of water beside him, and after a moment opened the messaging app again, not in haste, but with a casual rhythm that mirrored the rest of his movements that day, and typed a short message, followed by an emoji, then sent it without hesitation, and, while no one else in the room could see the name on the screen, the softness in his posture spoke clearly of familiarity, comfort, and a personal rhythm that required no announcement, and a few minutes later, he received a reply, just a single line. Yet it drew a quiet smile from him, the kind that lasted only a second but carried the weight of understanding between two people who did not need to explain themselves, and the apartment remained quiet aside from the low hum of electronics and the gentle ambient track still playing in the background, and outside, the city continued to move, unaware of the small exchange that had taken place, just as it remained unaware of the bouquet now standing quietly by the window, or the initials that had been spoken so casually in the studio the day before, and inside that moment, the contrast between public visibility and private stillness came into full view, where the life of a global artist intersected with the ordinary rituals of someone who valued silence, intentionality, and genuine connection. And as the evening wore on, Suga dimmed the lights, prepared a small meal, and sat down to eat alone, not in loneliness but in peace, and when he finished, he washed the dishes methodically, wiped the counters clean, then sat briefly by the window watching the occasional car pass by below. And in that pause, there was no sense of performance or pretense, just the continuation of a quiet evening shaped not by headlines or digital buzz but by the slow unfolding of a personal rhythm that had quietly shifted over time. And by the time he returned to his desk to jot down a few melodic ideas for a future project, the phone buzzed again with another message, this one even shorter than the last, and his response was equally brief, just a word and a punctuation mark. But like everything else that day, it carried the weight of a connection that had begun forming not from spectacle or status, but through the quiet accumulation of trust, familiarity, and time. And as the night deepened, the apartment grew quieter still, with only the faint light from his monitor and the soft glow from the hallway casting long shadows across the room. And in that space, Suga once again became simply himself. Not the face of a global phenomenon, but a man who, in the flow of an ordinary day, had allowed the world to see, just for a moment, the outline of someone who had chosen closeness over distance and presence over performance. And though no name had been spoken and no explanation given, for those who had followed the rhythm of his day, the inescapable truth remained that something real had quietly taken root.